Hello, we are here to present our paper entitled Exploring Influencing Factors on International Tourist Arrivals in the Philippines using K-means Clustering and Negative Binomial Regression. The presentation will start with introduction of the research problem, then K-means Clustering and Negative Binomial Regression, the methodology, then results and discussion, and conclusion. The background of the study revolves a general introduction of the Philippine tourism situation. In 2017, the tourism sector directly contributed 13% of the employment in the Philippines, and the income of international tourism reached 1.9 trillion Philippine pesos, which is much higher than 2009. In 2018, around 7 million international visitors came to the Philippines, compared to 3 million arrivals in 2009. So tourism is very important to the Philippines. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippine tourism industry is affected negatively. For the national economy, recovering tourism is necessary in the Philippines after the pandemic, so the potential factors are interesting to explore. This paper explores how influencing factors affect the number of international tourists. In addition, does the impact of these factors differ based on different classifications? For the different clusters, influencing factors will be explored. Specifically, the particular objectives of the paper include the following: to cluster the countries of the tourist's residence by purpose of travel to the Philippines using K-means clustering method, to estimate negative binomial regression for the whole observations, and to identify the determinants of foreign tourist arrivals in the Philippines sighting, and to build a negative binomial regression for each of the resulting clusters of countries, and assess whether the different purposes of travel within each cluster affect the relationship between international tourist arrivals and the selected factors. The factors were limited because of availability of data. Factors such as the transportation cost and cultural proximity will also have a specific impact on the inbound tourism. In addition, this paper analyzes the influencing factors of foreign tourists in the Philippines from a macro level. It lacks macro research on various reasons and fails to conduct field surveys. The basic idea of K-means clustering algorithm is expressed in two dimensions as follows. Firstly, select two initial cluster centers randomly, then traverse each point and calculate the Euclid distance to the two initial cluster centers. After that, compare what points are closest to the two initial cluster centers, and then combine them with their initial cluster centers. These points are classified into a cluster, then recalculate the new cluster centers, mean value of the objects in the clusters. Repeat until the number of clusters remains the same. K-means clustering is useful in exploratory data analysis. In recent years, K-means cluster technique is still used in tourism. In an example of the Indonesia tourism industry, some researchers grouped destinations by the distance-based K-means method. In 2020, some researchers applied K-means clustering on hotel reservation data in a tourism study on holiday reservations. In another example of the development of tourism in Ukraine, some researchers used the K-means technique to subdivide the regions of Ukraine according to the level of their tourism development in Ukraine. Some researchers proposed a generalized linear regression model. The generalized linear regression model extends the linear regression model in two aspects. Firstly, set a link function to connect the expectation of response variable with the linear independent variables. Secondly, give an arrow function to the arrow distribution. Some researchers proposed a negative binomial regression model in 1992. They conducted an example analysis showing that negative binomial regression model is better than the Poisson regression model when applied to count data. This research selects the secondary data of tourists from 58 countries, the residents of which entered the Philippines for tourism from 2009 to 2018 annually. The data comes from Philippine Statistical Yearbook, World Bank Open Data, and Official Gazette. The 8 variables on the table will be used for the K-means clustering. The 58 countries are classified so that countries from the same category have a similar distribution of the proportion of tourists visiting the Philippines. This research selects variables for negative binomial regression based on qualitative analysis of the influencing factors of inbound tourism in the Philippines, combined with the relevant foundations of consumption and demand theory. The 6 variables on the table are measured as factors that promote the number of inbound tourists from each country in the Philippines yearly. The number of inbound tourists is the most commonly used indicator of inbound tourism demand. For judging whether time series has a trend, researchers can observe the time series plot, but this is subjective. For estimating subjective factors, they may use the unit root or stationary test, which complement each other. The null hypotheses of unit root test and stationary test are opposite. If cannot reject HO of DF test and reject HO of KPSS test, both imply that series has a unit root. If reject HO of DF test and cannot reject HO of KPSS test, both imply that series is transstationary. If cannot reject both tests, it means that dataset does not give enough observations. If reject both tests, the series is difference stationary. To analyze the temporal pattern of the different tourism arrivals, package F unit roots and package T series will be used in R, and package ggplot2 will be used for plotting. K-means clustering algorithm will be carried out using procedures formulated by Harding and Wang. Function K-means will be used, and the random starting is a parameter in the function, and K-value will be determined by the method based on parameterized finite Gaussian mixture models, and the package mClust will be used. The negative binomial regression model is used when exploring the factors affecting the inbound tourism. Specifically, the deterministic model is shown here. Package AER and MAS will be used for negative binomial regression model. The time series from 2009 to 2018 for each of the different tourism arrival purpose is shown in the plot. Based on the plot, we can see only the pattern of the number of tourist arrivals for the holiday purpose has a trend. This research did unit root and stationary tests for the time series of each vacation purpose. The results for transstationary are shown in the tables. Since most of the p-values for both tests are greater than 0.05, we can reject both tests under these reasons. It means that the dataset does not give enough observations for these reasons. While for holiday purpose, since the p-value of KPSS test is greater than 0.05, cannot reject HO of KPSS test. The p-value of the DF test is smaller than 0.05. Reject null hypothesis of DF test. Both imply that series is transstationary for holiday purpose. According to the method based on parameterized finite Gaussian mixture models, the optimum K-value is 4. K means clustering based on the 4 algorithm were tried separately. When 1,000 random sites of initial center points were chosen for these 4 algorithms, the down index and the cluster results are same. The largest down index is around 0.12. The mean percentages of K-means clustering by regions and clusters are observed. Cluster 1 represents the countries the residents of which prefer to come to the Philippines for education, but less holiday and business. It is composed of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Iran, Nepal, and Nigeria, which are countries whose educational purposes are much higher than other clusters. Cluster Cluster 2 represents the countries the residents of which prefer to come to the Philippines for business. It is composed of India, Indonesia, etc. The average percentages in Cluster 2 for business purpose is much higher than the other clusters. Similarly, the average percentages in Cluster 3 and 4 for visiting friends and relatives holiday purpose are much higher than the other clusters. Notice the main reason visiting the Philippines for each cluster is holiday, which has the highest percentages in each cluster. Under the significant level of 0.05, there is evidence of overdispersion because the p-value of the overdispersion test is smaller than 0.05. As can be seen in the first table, this is the summary of the model for all countries under a significant level of 0.05. GDP per capita, and visited are positively significant for the number of tourists. If a country were to increase its GDP by 1 unit, the logarithm of the number of tourists would be expected to increase by 2.67 times 10 raised to negative 13 units, while holding the other variables in the model constant. Similarly, other variables can be explained like this. From the second table, no factors are significant for cluster 1 and the significant level of 0.05, but the p-value is close to 0.05. From the last table, GDP per capita visited are significant in cluster 2. Similarly, from these two tables, population, labor productivity, and visited are significant for the number of tourists in cluster 3. GDP and visited are significant for the number of tourists in cluster 4. Now, the results of the K-means clustering and negative binomial regression can be combined. In cluster 1, the main reason visiting the Philippines is holiday purpose, and the education reason is much higher than the other clusters, and so on. The president's visit has impact on the expected tourism arrivals in cluster 2, 3, and 4. Also, in different clusters, the influencing factors are different. This result can be compared with other researchers. The paper, The Impact of Government Failure on Tourism in the Philippines, showed that the US FAA down degree and the EU ban impact tourist receipts negatively, which also indicates the political factor has impact on tourism. The second study classifies the source countries based on the air travel duration to the destination. In different classifications, the influencing factors are also different. By investigating the influencing factors of each cluster separately, the following conclusions are drawn. The factors in this study are not significant for the number of tourists from the countries in cluster 1. The probable reason could be that the countries in cluster 1 have relatively poor economies, so the general economic indexes are invalid. Policymakers should focus on the people for holiday purpose to improve the development of tourism, because the tourist arrivals for this reason have an increasing trend. The Department of Tourism may suggest that the president visits more countries. When formulating tourism policies for countries in different categories, policymakers should consider separately rather than a common one. Due to time and data limitations, there are still imperfect places. Firstly, researchers may consider how to introduce more independent variables in future research. Secondly, in the analysis of the temporal pattern, the test results show that there is no enough observations for most of purpose. In future studies, larger sample size should be used. Finally, this study is based on K-means and negative binomial regression models. Consider other regression models. Thank you very much for listening.